All right, so have you ever gotten a brand new gadget, like the latest and greatest fitness tracker, and you're so excited to use it, but when you try to connect it to your phone, it's like they're speaking different languages?
That's the worst
And it
equivalence.
feels like it always happens with Apple products. Well, the EU has definitely taken notice, and they're stepping up to challenge tech giants like Apple on this whole idea of interoperability,
Hmm.
which is exactly what we're diving into today. We've got this article that breaks down how the EU is using something called the Digital Markets Act, DMA for short, to try and shake things up a bit. But before we go any further, can you give us a quick rundown of what the DMA actually is?
Sure. Think of it like this. The DMA is basically a set of rules specifically designed for these major tech companies like Apple that have a huge influence on all of our digital lives. The EU is basically stepping in and saying, look, with great power comes great responsibility.
Hmm.
The DMA is all about making sure these companies aren't unfairly pushing out the competition and trying to control everything in the digital space.
So it's like setting some ground rules to ensure everyone's playing fair in the tech world.
Right, exactly. And one of the big ways the EU is aiming to even that playing field is through something called interoperability.
Okay, so what does interoperability even mean when we're talking about, say, my smartphone?
In the simplest terms, it means that your devices, no matter who made them, should be able to talk to each other and work together smoothly. So that means your non-Apple smartwatch, your headphones, fitness tracker, even your smart home devices. They should all connect and work with your iPhone just as easily as an Apple product would.
So no more tech silos, no more being penalized for not going all in on one brand's ecosystem. That sounds like a win for consumers.
It is. And it's not just about convenience either, though that's a huge part of it. This could even impact pricing. Take smart home ecosystems as an example. If there's not much interoperability, companies can jack up the prices for their own branded devices because they know consumers are stuck. More competition because of interoperability, well, that could result in lower prices and even more innovation.
That's a really good point. I hadn't even thought about it that way, but it makes a lot of sense. And I'm guessing that this whole interoperability thing is a sticking point for Apple, a company that's known for its pretty closed ecosystem.
You're absolutely right. And the EU is really focusing on two specific areas where Apple's practices are raising red flags.
All right, so let's dive into those two areas the EU is targeting. What's the first one?
Well, first up, you've got connecting devices. Like we were just talking about, imagine a world where your non-Apple smartwatch, headphones, or fitness tracker could seamlessly connect to your iPhone. No more messing around with complicated settings or dealing with limited features just because you decided to go with a different brand.
Yeah, that can be a real pain. Especially these days, it feels like you shouldn't have to be locked into one brand for every single device you own, you know?
Exactly. And that leads us right into the second big point of friction, app developers getting a fair shake.
Ah, right, the App Store. But how does that tie back into interoperability? It sounds more like an issue for developers, not really for users like me.
Oh, it definitely affects you as a user too. Think about it. Let's say there's this amazing developer out there with a killer idea for a new fitness app, right?
Hmm.
But if they want to get that app on iPhones, they have to play by Apple's rules. Apple controls which apps get seen, what they can or can't do, and they even take a big chunk of the developer's profits. That stifles competition, which ultimately means fewer choices for you and me, and potentially even higher prices.
So it's kind of like Apple's acting as a gatekeeper, deciding who gets to be a part of their world and who gets left out in the cold.
Exactly. And this isn't exactly new territory for Apple either. Remember what happened with Apple Pay?
Oh, right.
The EU took issue with how Apple made it practically impossible for other mobile wallets to work smoothly on iPhones. Basically, Apple used their control over the iPhone to give Apple Pay an advantage.
Now that you mention it, this whole thing is starting to sound familiar. So is the EU basically taking what they learned from that Apple Pay case and applying it more broadly?
You got it. The EU realized that this lack of interoperability goes way beyond just payments. It's a pattern that's affecting competition and innovation across the board in the tech world.
It's like they're putting their foot down with Apple.
They are. And the EU means business with this DMA. They can actually hit companies like Apple with fines of up to 10% of their global revenue.
Wow, 10%. That's gotta hurt. Even for a giant like Apple. Talk about motivation to cooperate. But beyond the financial penalties, what kind of real impact could this have on Apple and the entire tech industry if they don't get on board with these interoperability rules? So are we talking about a major shakeup in the tech world then? Is this the beginning of the end for Apple's walled garden as we know it?
It's definitely a turning point. If the EU can actually enforce these interoperability rules, it could have huge implications globally. Other countries might follow their lead. We might see a big shift towards a more open, competitive tech landscape overall, which wouldn't just affect Apple. It could impact any tech giant that has a tight grip on its own little ecosystem.
It's kind of wild to imagine a world where you could easily switch between, say, using an Android phone one day and an iPhone the next and have all your devices still play nice together. That's like the dream, right?
Right. It's definitely an appealing idea. But like with any major tech change, it's not all sunshine and roses. We have to think about the potential downsides too.
Okay, so what could go wrong? What are the trade-offs here?
Well, one big one is security. When you start opening up ecosystems and allowing all sorts of connections between different devices and platforms, you inevitably create more points where things could go wrong.
That makes sense.
Think about your data, your privacy. A more open system, if it's not properly secured, could make it easier for hackers to get in.
So it's a balancing act then. We gain freedom and flexibility, but potentially at the cost of security. Not an easy thing to figure out.
Yeah. Exactly. And it's something we all need to be a part of, figuring out. Policymakers, tech companies, and everyday users like us. There's no simple answer, but understanding what we might gain or lose with interoperability is crucial.
This has been a fascinating look at how tech might be changing, that's for sure. And I have a feeling this is something we'll be talking a lot more about, right?
Oh, absolutely. This is just the beginning. And you know what? We want to know what you think.
Yes.
What are your thoughts on this push for interoperability? Do the benefits outweigh the risks?
Head over to our social media and tell us what you think. We love hearing from all of you. Until next time, stay curious, and we'll catch you on our next deep dive.